I am here with Dr. Blake Hereth, philosophy professor, and Z is going to talk to us today about pronouns. Thank you so much, Dr. Hereth, for agreeing to meet with us. So, pronouns. Where should we start when it comes to pronouns? I'm trying to understand this dialogue, and a lot of times people say, "Well, your pronoun has something to do with your gender, not your sex." Help me understand, what does this distinction have to do with understanding pronouns?
Good. Yeah. So sex usually refers to a person's reproductive parts. So things like vaginas, penises, ovaries, breasts, so on. So when you have one cluster of parts, you're female, another you're male, a mix, and you're what's called intersex. I should note that some philosophers are very skeptical of the view that there even is such a thing as biological sex, but on average, right, most philosophers, most people think that there is such a thing. Gender, on the other hand, it that's a more complicated question about what gender is. So I don't want to pretend that there are any easy answers to this question, but gender usually refers to gender identity. So some people try to pry them apart, including some really smart philosophers, and they say that gender is about behavior, right? So whether you're more feminine or more masculine or more androgynous in your presentation. So I think of Judith Butler, for example, who has this famous line that gender is performance, right? It's how you behave and live in the world. So in the same way that we can sometimes say they're really feminine men, they're really masculine women, right? Even though we're talking about two different sorts of things there, some people try to pry them apart and think of gender as a kind of behavior in that way. I'm a little more inclined to think of it in terms of gender identity.
Okay, so I'm curious, what would be a reason to say that there is no such thing as biological sex? Is that what you said? How,
Yes,
what?
yeah. So it's not my view, but there are some, and it is a minority view, even among philosophers of gender, but and philosophers of sex. But there are some people who defend it, and um, essentially, like one sort of reason you can give is for thinking of this as the sort of discrete categories that we usually like to put these different reproductive parts into. There's a lot more variation in human beings and in the rest of nature than is sort of credited by this binary male female only idea of sex. And even if you throw intersex people into the mix, right, it's still more complicated than that. So I think for a lot of reasons, this notion of biological sex, as a lot of philosophers have pointed out, it evolved as a way of trying to understand reproduction in nature. So in a way, it is a kind of model, right? It's supposed to serve a particular kind of purpose, whether it's real in some sort of deep sense, any more than species are real in some sort of deep biological sense, or race is real in some deep biological sense, I think is a really open question.
Okay, and then other than this picture that I just asked you to help me elaborate and understand better, your view is something about personal identity. So help me understand what your view is.
Yeah, so when I talk about gender, somebody having a particular gender, I have in mind gender identity. And one way to, maybe the easiest way to understand gender identity is that it refers to a person's gender self idea. So that sounds like mumbo jumbo, but it's not. All of us think of ourselves in particular ways, right? We think of ourselves as religious or not, as intelligent or not, as funny or not. And most people also think of themselves as men or women. So gender identity refers to that inner felt sense of gender. And interestingly, the scientific evidence shows that our gender identity is not fleeting, but rather it's part of our deep psychology that develops in childhood. So there's interesting evidence done by psychologists at my alma mater, the University of Washington in Seattle, where they actually developed implicit association tests that are usually used for measuring bias, like racial bias and things like that, or gender bias. And they apply these tests to children, and they found that their implicit attitudes, their implicit reactions among, say, trans boys versus cis boys or trans girls versus cis girls were identical. There were no significant differences in their implicit attitudes, suggesting that it is very much a part of our deep psychology.
Okay, that's an interesting answer, but help me understand what exactly you're saying. So, cisgender, cis girl versus transgender. Can you help me understand what we're really talking about here?
Sure. So the terms cis and trans are actually they're navigational tools. They come from terms of navigation. So if you were having a cis-Atlantic journey or something like that, then you would really just be traveling along the coast, okay? You wouldn't really be crossing an ocean. Whereas if you have a transatlantic journey, then you're going from one side of it to another. So when we talk about cis people, we're usually talking about people who very much identify with the gender or gender identity that was assigned to them at birth. They don't feel any kind of incongruence with the way people talk about them, the pronouns people use for them, the identities such as man or woman that are ascribed to them. Whereas trans people, and I use that as a very big umbrella term to include non-binary people, who are people who say I'm not a man or a woman. That broad sort of umbrella, those are people who just do not identify with the gender that they were assigned at birth.
A cis person is someone who feels like what they were assigned, but also what you're assigned is like another social construct and not really real. What am I trying to get at here? There's something I'm missing.
Yeah, so if you're sort of getting at the idea that gender is socially constructed, that's a pretty popular view. Pretty much across the spectrum, people who hold all sorts of different views in philosophy of gender. So a lot of times when we think about even how we think of ourselves, right? Go back to some of the other examples I give, right? As religious or not, intelligent or not, funny or not. Well, there are certain kinds of social norms, right, that we make up. What counts as funny? What counts as intelligent? What counts as religious or not? Okay. If you're an atheist who really has a strong affinity for nature and you feel that it's mystical in some sort of way, is that religious? Right. So in some ways, these categories are a bit socially constructed. But that doesn't really mean, of course, that doesn't have to mean anything bad for trans or non-binary people any more than it has to mean that cis men or cis women aren't real or don't exist. It really just means that on some level, we're sort of making up these categories and trying to carve up the world in a very particular sort of way. So all that to say, you can definitely be a social constructionist about gender. That is a fairly popular view.
Okay, so let's say that we go with that view, we subscribe to it, and now all of a sudden we've blurred all of these lines. In what sense are pronouns still important?
Yeah. So
If at all.
Yeah, good. So I think there are a couple things that can be said here. So one is just to first address why people have different pronouns in the first place. Okay. So I think the reason behind that, just in terms of just describing the history of how it came about, is there are different sexes, different genders, different gender identities. And so people develop pronouns that help distinguish them, sort of track these differences. Now, in terms of a question of why should we care about people's pronouns, right? If that's sort of what you're wondering about, I think the most general answer to that is we should care about people's pronouns because we should care about people. And caring about people means honoring their wishes and not denying identities that are important to them. So for example, we can all agree it would be wrong of me to refer to a Jewish person as a Buddhist because that misrepresents their faith, which is important to their identity. And by analogy, it would be wrong of me to refer to a trans woman using he, him pronouns because that misrepresents her gender identity.
So should we ask people, what is your pronoun? I'm imagining your analogy is pretty clear and solid. So I wouldn't want to assume somebody's faith. I would just ask if I was curious. So should I just ask somebody's pronoun?
So I think there are two sort of separate questions there. One is, should we ask people their pronouns? And the other one is, should we assume people's pronouns? And I agree with you. I think the answer to should we assume people's pronouns is no, we should not. Pronouns are supposed to track gender identity, but gender identity is invisible to the naked eye, right? So just as you wouldn't assume someone's name or someone's religion based on how they look, so also you shouldn't assume their gender identity by assuming their pronouns. Now, the separate question of should we ask people their pronouns as a form of respect, there is a little bit of division about this, a bit of disagreement, but I sort of have a firm view on this. So my propaganda hat is on here. So I'm not so undecided on this. My answer is absolutely not. Asking people their pronouns is a form of outing them because you put them in a position where you force them to either reveal who they are or slink deeper into the closet. And at least speaking from my own experience, there can often be a lot of self-shaming and a lot of self-doubt that comes with feeling forced to either say exactly who you are. There's a lot of fear that goes with that, or to just further deny who you really are in front of everybody else. What I think we should do is provide people opportunities to disclose their pronouns at their discretion.
Okay. So I'm seeing a potential obstacle. On one hand, we shouldn't assume people's gender. On the other hand, we shouldn't ask people their gender. And your solution is give a avenue for people to say what they want to say and not say what they don't want to say. But in certain circumstances, you might um, be walking down the street and somebody drops something and you want to say, "Excuse me, miss, you dropped something." And are you assuming that they're a woman because you said miss and female and all of these buzzwords go on? So where does the gendered language start and stop? And how can we avoid disrespecting people but still talk with them?
Yeah, so I don't think that someone's pronouns determine whether they're mom, dad, ma'am, sir, lady, gentleman, so on and so forth. They don't determine it, but you're right that they are strongly correlated. So most people using she, her pronouns also prefer mom, ma'am, lady, right? That combination. But there are some exceptions. So, for example, a friend of mine who's a trans man prefers he, him pronouns, but still prefers that his children call him mom, since that's what they've always done. And he doesn't really want that to change. So that's a particular case where the honorific, right, of mom, right, doesn't seem to match up very well with the pronouns, right? The correlation doesn't really hold there. But in general, I think the correlation holds. Now, in terms of what should we do just as a default, I mean, I'm sort of inclined to think that we shouldn't be using terms like sir, ma'am, things like that, unless we really do have a sense of the person's gender, which I think we can only really get from direct testimony, or that's the most reliable way. But using they, them pronouns is a sort of functional default in the meanwhile to say, hey, you dropped your stuff, or hey, they dropped their stuff, I think is a perfectly fine way of doing things. Now, there is an interesting question because not all languages have right things like they, them pronouns. And maybe there are other languages where there's going to be an opportunity to be linguistically creative and invent some sort of gender neutral set of pronouns.
So I have a really good friend, Sohaila, and she told me that in Farsi, there is almost no way to categorize someone as a gender. And I thought about it, and I was like saying Farsi things in my head, trying to prove that yes, there is, and no, there isn't. I mean, you talk about other people in Farsi as if they're objects, and there's no gender about it. So that's a really interesting point that you bring up. So for the English speaking world, let's just like narrow the scope a little bit.
Sure.
For the English speaking world, you think a good solution is by default just use they or them. And so here's an objection, and then I would really like to hear how you can just knock down that objection. I'm sure there's a way. So I heard an argument by a elementary school teacher lobbying against the state who wanted to teach gender fluidity. So the state wants to teach gender fluidity in the school. And this elementary school teacher said that the kids are confused enough when it comes to what they means and singular pronouns, plural pronouns. And if we teach the children to use they for a one person, it's going to just confuse them more. So I suppose that would be an objection to your default solution. How would you knock that down?
Good. Yeah. So I think that first thing I want to say is that any sort of competent K through 12 teacher at some point is going to tell to introduce their students to the singular person form of they, them. Contrary to what is often said by people who raise this objection, referring to a single particular individual as they or them and as a singular form has it's very, very, very long-term practice. In fact, Merriam-Webster released a bit, I think in the last couple of years, noting that this use of it goes back at least to the 1600s in the English language. So I would worry about a K through 12 teacher who was worried about introducing that as if it shouldn't just be part of core English curriculum. Now, in terms of actually educating kids about gender fluidity specifically, I don't really think that that's as hard as a lot of teachers think it is to introduce. In fact, sometimes a lot of kids get confused. For example, trans kids get confused when they are classified a particular sort of way and only men and women are talked about, or they're talked about as having certain kinds of parts. Whereas we're already introducing, right, sort of cis gender identities in terms of biology and other sort of stuff in the classroom. So talking about the possibility of what your gender identity is fundamentally how you think of yourself. And some people think of themselves as very flexible, as very fluid, as changing over time from one sort of thing to another. That in the same way people can change their opinions and in the same way we learn and grow in school, we can also self-discover our gender in various ways over time. So I don't really think that this is a difficult thing for at least good teachers to explain to students.
What actual difference does it make if somebody is referred to as they or he or z? What hangs on that? Why is that important?
Yeah, so if the question is what actual difference do someone's pronouns make? So I think there's sort of two general answers to this. First of all, they make a moral difference. They allow people to avoid being misgendered or misidentified as a different sort of gender and avoid all of the psychological harms that typically accompany being misgendered. But they also make an epistemic difference, a difference to whether or not we're believing what's true. So some pronouns, right, they accurately refer to a person's gender identity and some don't. So if you were going to refer to a non-binary person using binary pronouns like he or she, you in some ways are going to be implying that they have a gender identity that they don't. And that is to say something false or imply something false or have a false belief. So I think for both moral and epistemic reasons, we have, right, what pronouns we use for people actually do make a big difference.
Let me talk to you more about the epistemic difference that it makes.
Sure.
So it sounds like you're hinting at some kind of authority, and I hope to hear more about that. So if I have breasts, or let's imagine I did, and I have longer hair, that's associated stereotypically with women, not with men, at least in America. Now, and things change all the time, but if you were to look at me and assume my gender, you'll probably assume that I'm a woman. And if you refer to me as she, and I say that's not my gender, please refer to me as they, it sounds like you're hinting at something like the person themselves is the authority on what their pronoun is. Can you help me understand that better?
Certainly. So I'm a big fan of first person authority, meaning that I think fundamentally our best and most reliable guide to what people's identities are, whether they're, Jewish or not, Muslim or not, funny or not, maybe in some cases, or what their gender identity is to ask them. They are in many ways the most reliable and the final authority on what their gender identity is. Now, there are some cases, I think, where unfortunately people say that they are a particular gender as a way of mocking trans and non-binary people, and so they're acting in bad faith.
Oh, what do you mean?
And yeah, so there are sometimes. So I think, for example, of trying to remember what her name is, Gina Carallo, who was on The Mandalorian. She listed her pronouns on Twitter as beep bop boop, which was a sort of way of mocking people who don't use binary gender specific pronouns like she and he. So I think that's a sort of case where we have good reason to believe that Gina was not seriously suggesting that those are the pronouns that she goes by, but rather that she made this remark in an effort to mock trans and non-binary people. But I think in cases where you don't have reason to believe that somebody's acting in bad faith, right, where somebody seems to be quite sincere and genuine in telling you what their pronouns are and what their gender identity is, that should be the first and final authority.
So I wonder if there's a total set of actual pronouns that someone might sincerely attribute to themselves. So the he and the she, we've heard that for a very long time. They, them, we've heard that for a very long time. Some people go by Z or Zer. Are there other ones?
Yes, there are. And I think we should resist the suggestion that there's some sort of cap on the number of possible pronouns that we could use. Again, part of this is reflective of the fact that there, other than they, them, a lot of the non-binary pronouns that exist in the English languages and some other languages were invented. They are neologisms, they're new words, they're new, right? They're new concepts. So we are constantly trying to reform a language that, to coin a phrase, right, is very cis-normative, or it is normed around cisgender people. It just tries to reflect he, she, and they is more often used as, well, we don't know if it's a he or if the person is a he or a she yet, and that's the only reason we're using they. So in the efforts to transform the language, there's just no predicting how many different combinations or possibilities will arise. The other sort of consideration is that in other languages, I think that non-English language users or people who primarily use other languages, they may create forms of non-binary pronouns that are well suited to the phonetics of their language. And so, yeah, I think for a lot of reasons, there's just not going to be a cap on it, and we're going to have just a large number of pronouns over time.
I also want to know if there's something wrong with saying that you're one gender and then changing your mind and then changing your mind, much in the way that there might be something wrong with continuously changing your faith. I imagine those track each other. Can you help me understand something in this part?
Certainly. So I think there's one sort of question about is there some sort of problem with, reinterpreting or interpreting differently your gender over time, or being gender fluid, changing your pronouns. And then there's this other sort of issue with, say that I, had identified as non-binary for a long time, right? And so I asked people to use they, them, these are pronouns for me. But maybe then, over the years, I come to start thinking of myself as a woman. And I think actually, maybe I was right before, maybe I wasn't, I don't know, but minimally, I think I am a woman. And let's say you refer to me using they, them pronouns. Well, I think the right sort of attitude is then there's just, you're treating me in a way that aligns with my prior wishes, with the pronouns and the identity that I asked you to refer to me to. But now in a way, I've come into a new sort of identity, or maybe my identity hasn't changed, I've just recognized it, right? Or something like that. I'm kind of getting down to the core of who I am now. And in that case, I don't think we should really be too upset with you for honoring my prior wishes. I think we should just update you on my current wishes. Now, in terms of the first bit about, is it wrong to change your pronouns several times over the course of your life? No, of course not, provided that you're doing so in good faith, right? Going back to what I said earlier. So changing your pronouns isn't wrong isn't any more wrong than changing your name. And people change their names all the time, right? When they get married, for practical reasons. When I taught at the University of Washington, I had a lot of students who were from mainland China, and they would adopt nicknames, right? And those would be their preferred names in the system. So I think that sort of thing is fine. I think an important but often unrecognized problem is that trans and non-binary people are on a journey of self-discovery, and that they're on that journey because we live in a cis-normative world, right? A world that recognizes and caters only to cis men and cis women. So the result is that we don't immediately understand ourselves. Cis-normativity, it obscures and misinterprets our experiences. So if anything, we owe one another the space to change our pronouns as we self-discover.
That sounds like also an argument to bring gender fluidity to elementary schools to sort of counteract the cis normative structures in placed on those people who grow up and they are adults yet still don't know themselves because they've been battling the world. Do you think so too? Would that be an argument to keep the options open from a young age?
I think so. So Robin Dembroff, who's a philosophy professor at Yale University, has this really great piece, this really great article titled, I hope I don't butcher it, Gender Queer as Critical Gender Kind. And they talk about gender queer as this sort of broad catch-all category for people who don't identify as men or women. So they identify, I'm calling them non-binary. I think we're sort of using those terms in the same sort of way. But Dembroff says there are critical gender kinds, and then there are non-critical gender kinds. And critical gender kinds are ones that, as they put it, destabilize a lot of these axes of gender oppression, okay? Whereas non-critical gender kinds are ones that help to stabilize it, at least in part. So it does seem to me that, of course, we want to destabilize, right? Trans misogyny, all these sort of things that are connected with it, queer phobia. And one sort of way to do that is to introduce, right, these sort of the many beautiful colors that human beings come in, the many shapes and sizes and the differences, and not shy away from them, but actually make kids aware of them. And sooner the better.
And are pronouns legally significant?
Yes, I think they are. So pronoun usage is usually viewed as a kind of gender expression, falls under gender expression, which is protected by law. So for example, there was a very controversial law in 2016 that was passed in New York City law that requires employers and other entities to use the name, pronoun, and title, right, that a person identifies with, regardless of the sex they were assigned at birth, anatomy, gender, medical history, appearance, the sex that's indicated on their ID. So there weren't any major federal protections in the United States for gender identity until last year, when the Supreme Court ruled in a case called Bostock versus Clayton County, Georgia, that Title VII, which is about gender-based discrimination, prohibits discrimination based on gender identity. So I'm not a legal scholar, right? And this is new precedent, okay, right? It's just the ruling came down last year, so there's a lot that has to get fleshed out. So I'm not really sure how this ruling is going to affect things like intentionally misgendering people, right? Getting their pronouns wrong. But I do think that these rulings provide reasons for optimism for trans and non-binary people. And anybody who uses non-binary pronouns, right? And at the very least, I think it's going to encourage people to be more aware of what it means to respect one another in a legally important sense.
So I'm curious if we should all have the same pronouns?
Yeah, so I'm undecided about that, but there are some very smart philosophers like Robin Dembroff, I mentioned earlier, and Daniel Wodak, and they think that the answer is yes. And one of the reasons they think that the answer is yes is because, well, I mean, they give a lot of reasons, and I don't want to oversimplify what they say, but they give two big reasons. One of which is that If we all sort of use the same pronouns, then the risks of misgendering people go way down, right? They drop to zero. The other sort of consideration they give is they say, when we use binary gender specific pronouns, things like he and she, we are actually in some ways revealing private information about a person. And so, and it may be information that that individual didn't consent to have disclosed, information about their genetics or what genitals they have or things like that, or maybe even more privately, what their gender identity is. So I get that, and I think they make a really strong case, but I hesitate for two reasons to say we should all have the same pronoun. So the first one is that I worry that if we use a singular set of pronouns like they and them for everyone, then trans people who have waited for years to have their identities as men or women recognized will never get that full recognition that comes from having a certain set of pronouns ascribed to them. The second sort of worry I have is that I think it's maybe a mistake to assume that pronouns like they and them really are gender neutral. Because I think some people use those pronouns in a very gender specific way. So they think of them as very uniquely matched with and therefore specific to being non-binary, say. Okay. So I don't think that everybody who uses these they, them pronouns is just a sort of like catch-all for other, right? It's like he, she, they. They is everything else. I don't think that everybody uses they, them in that sort of way. And as a result, I'm hesitant to view they, them pronouns and other non-binary pronouns like that as gender neutral when people use them in very gender specific ways.
My last question will be pretty open-ended. If you could have a take-home message when it comes to pronouns, something like, if you don't remember anything else about pronouns, remember this, what would it be?
Listen to other people. Give them the space, make them comfortable enough for them to disclose your pronouns. You'll be a better person, you'll be a better friend, you'll be a better coworker, you'll be a better student if you do that. You'll also have, hopefully, right, fewer false beliefs and more true beliefs. But yeah, I think listening is the big thing I would say. And connected with that, when you make a mistake, apologize, correct yourself. We know that people mess up. We know that people mess up through no fault of their own, right? We all have slips of the tongue. We all have sloppy moments, okay? And it's, yeah, me too, okay? But so you don't have to, but go ahead and apologize anyway. You don't have to assume that you're at fault in some sort of deep way. Sometimes we harm people unintentionally, and we need to own up to it and just say, hey, I didn't intend it, but I'm still sorry it happened. I'm sorry that you are suffering, that it impacted you, okay? So correct yourself. Don't make a big deal out of it to the other person, to the person you misgendered. Just apologize, listen to them, learn from them, and move on and do better.